Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 24th of March. I'm John Connolly, the Spectator's news editor, and I'll be your host this week. On this week's show, Rishi Sunak gave his spring statement on Wednesday. The Chancellor boasted that he was unveiling the largest single tax cut in a decade, while the OBR said living standards would suffer from the biggest fall since records began in the 1950s. The Spectator's Kate Andrews, James Forsyth and Katy will talk us through the Chancellor's statement. It's been 4 weeks since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, and US intelligence officials say the invasion has stalled, with Putin's forces still struggling to take key cities. What's the full story? We'll find out with Mark Galeotti and Dmitri Alperovitch. In this week's cover story, Owen Matthews looks at how Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has become the key middleman between Putin and the West. He'll be on to explain and discuss Turkey's dilemma alongside Hannah Lucinda Smith. And finally, is China's zero-COVID strategy falling apart? Matt Ridley writes in this week's magazine that Omicron is spreading through the country like a bushfire. He'll be on the show with Cindy Yu. Before we get going, a very special thank you to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, who are sponsoring the Week in 60 Minutes. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who go above and beyond to offer you support and guidance. Just visit candowealth.com to find out more. Remember as well to subscribe to our YouTube channel too. Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Rishi Sunak gave his spring statement in the Commons yesterday, announcing measures which he said would ease the cost of living crisis. Will they? I'm joined now by the Spectator's economics editor, Kate Andrews, our political editor, James Forsyth, and our deputy political editor, Katy. James, Katy and Kate, thank you for coming on Spectator TV. Right, Kate, to start us off, the Chancellor promised before this spring statement, or wanted us to think at least, that he was now a low tax-cutting Tory. Do you think he managed to succeed this week?
Well, if you look at the newspaper headlines this morning, I think it's actually going to be a rough ride for Rishi Sunak over the next few weeks and months, because the truth is that the cost of living squeeze is only going to worsen, inflation is only going to go up, interest rates are going to go up, and the Chancellor has been very clear for months now that he can't lift all the pain, he can't lift every bit of financial burden that's going to fall on people's shoulders, but I think for a lot of people out there, it's only going to get worse. The difficulty is that while he has certainly announced tax cuts in this spring statement, fuel duty is going to fall by 5p, the national insurance threshold has risen by almost £3,000, it's the biggest threshold raise on record. He's going to be cutting income tax as well by 2024. He says he's going to reduce the basic rate from 20p to 19p. The other tax hikes that he's brought in previously, freezing personal allowance thresholds, corporation tax, the national insurance levy for those who will still be paying it, outweigh what he's cut. So you can look at his tax cuts and certainly say, yes, he is a tax-cutting chancellor, but you can also look at the tax raises and point out that in a few years' time, the tax burden is actually going to be at a 77-year high, up from a 71-year high. So a lot of it is the narrative that you want to craft. And the question behind all this is what is Rishi Sunak really trying to achieve? And I think he's trying to bring some fiscally responsible ideas back to his government that actually we can't keep spending money and cutting taxes and have everything we want without saying how we're going to pay for it. That's why he doubled down on that NI hike. He said, if you want more money for health and social care, and that's long-term spending, you can't borrow it, it's got to come from taxes. But he's also thinking about the money that he has to hold back as interest rates and inflation continue to go up, because what we're now paying to service the debt, around £83 billion a year, that's just to pay the interest on money we've already borrowed, is 4 times higher than it was last year. It's certainly bigger than what we spend on defense overall in this country. These are payments that we can't get around. We have to pay them. And it's an incredible sum of money. So he's trying to juggle all of these things. And I think the difficulty for the Chancellor is that in a way, he's made a lot of people somewhat happy, but he's made very few people completely happy.
And Katy, Kate mentioned the front pages there. How has the spring statement been received generally, do you think?
I would say pretty negatively. I think you can caveat and say if you're facing the worst cost of living crisis in records since 1950, which is the OBR's projection, what is it that the government could do to really make that not an issue? Could they really get rid of the whole thing? And therefore, this is fairly caveated, but if you look at the front pages, lots of people picking up on that point by the OBR, and then you have a situation where those left-leaning papers are highlighting the fact that they don't think that Rishi Sunak has done enough for the vulnerable. There was nothing new on benefits when it came to the spring statement. And then on the right, you have papers of ultimately, such as the Daily Mail, calling for more tax cuts. Telegraph, pretty negative. And therefore, you can see that Rishi Sunak is trying to say he's a tax cutter. As Kate points out when you look at the figures, that is questionable, but he's clearly trying to signal this. But I think the issue is it's not enough for the right, and yet you're still seeing a situation where, for example, Rishi Sunak spoke to Tory MPs after the spring statement in private at a meeting of the 22 committee. And I would say, to be honest, that from those in the room, and there were only around 50 MPs there because it was a one-line whip, that it had a mixed reception. I wouldn't say it was nearly as negative from the various people I've spoken to there as the papers are. You had some Tory grandees actually praising Rishi Sunak in terms of the threshold and the plan for an income tax cut. You had some Red Wall MPs saying the threshold changing on national insurance was a good thing. It was going to make this national insurance hike a lot less painful for their constituents. But ultimately, you couldn't get around cost of living. And John Redwood, the Tory MP, was saying that the Treasury was massively underestimating the cost of living, and you were going to need to have many more tax cuts in order to fix this. So you can see that Rishi Sunak is being pushed to go further. And I think the question is, in the coming months as pressure grows, we expect to see more in terms of energy, I would imagine, by the autumn when it gets to the budget. But is he going to come into pressure more on things like universal credit and bring that in line with inflation? I would say probably yes.
James, do you think Rishi Sunak's in a bit of an impossible position here, and he perhaps doesn't have as much wriggle room as some of his critics say?
Well, the truth is that the problem with inflation is that there are no winners from it. There are only losers. It makes everyone poorer. So if you're in an environment where inflation is going to hit a 40-year high, as the OBR predicts, politics is going to become very scratchy and very difficult. Governments essentially have four options when it comes to raising revenue. They can borrow the money, and for all the reasons that Kate Andrews just articulated, that is an increasingly unappealing prospect right now because the cost of servicing that debt is going up. You can raise taxes, and as Katy Ball said, with taxes at a 70-odd-year high, that is not an appealing prospect. That leaves you just two other options. One is spending restraint, and the other is growth. And the truth is the UK economy has grown very slowly and very sluggishly since the financial crisis. Before, in the 30 years before the crash, productivity grew at 2.2% a year on average. In the years since the crash, it's grown at a measly 0.4%. And I think that means that we are entering into a new period of spending restraint, and that is going to be very difficult, tetchy politics. You look at the fact that departments weren't compensated for the fact that inflation is higher now than it was in October in this statement. And I think that points you to below inflation pay rises for lots of public sector professionals. That is going to be politically difficult, especially for those public sector professionals who feel that they particularly bore the brunt of the pandemic in terms of workload. So I think politics is going to become very difficult, but I think that is an inevitable consequence of what happens when inflation gets going in the way that it is. And it is just worth remembering that, how afraid of inflation politicians used to be. And I think that this generation of both central bankers and politicians were too complacent about the risks of inflation. And I mean, inflation is now up and running, and it is very difficult to control once that is the case.
I mean, Kate, in his statement, Rishi Sunak mentioned the fact that recent inflation figures hadn't taken into consideration the energy cap. Do you think things are going to get worse for the economy, essentially, and for the Treasury by extension?
Almost certainly. What's happened with the economic sanctions against Russia, while morally correct, are going to have a really big economic impact here at home, most of Europe trying to wean itself off of Russian energy means that prices are going to be hiked for us because there's going to be more competition for the gas and imports that we've been bringing in. One of the things about the energy price cap, which I think has more or less been disastrous for UK energy policy, it's put dozens and dozens of companies out of business. One of the things about it, at least for the Treasury, is that they will have some idea. The Ofgem will announce in October the extent to which that price cap is lifting further. So they will know how much support people need. And because that isn't happening again until the autumn, that did take the pressure off of Rishi Sunak in this budget to announce more direct support. But as James was pointing out in our Coffee House Shots live event last night, the Treasury just a month ago dedicated £9 billion to try to support people, especially the most vulnerable, through this most recent energy price cap lift, which is coming in April, dishing out hundreds of pounds for the vast majority of households to help ease the burden of those bills. That is a colossal sum of money. And it's almost gone out the window. People have almost forgotten about it, asking, what's the next subsidy going to be? And the really hard truth here, it's not that we're out of money. It's that we're now, with inflation going as high as it is, with interest rates set to rise further, we're now having to talk about tough trade-offs. You can't just keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and saying that you're going to pay it back at a later date, because just the interest payments now they're not crippling us, but they certainly could soon. I mean, £83 billion just to service the debt is, a mind-boggling amount of money. You don't get new hospital beds for that. You don't get new nurses or doctors. You're just paying off money that you've already borrowed. So, if you want to help people with their energy bills come autumn, it's going to be another tough conversation about trade-offs, where that money comes from. Does it come from tax hikes? Are we going to spend a little less in other areas to help the most vulnerable with their bills in October? But this is the inevitable consequence of 2 years of global economies locking down and then kickstarting, and the shortages and the labor crunches that have come from that. It's the consequence of economic sanctions, as I said before, the right thing to do, but still painful. There are costs attached to all these things. And I think, if you are going to point to the failure of this government in communication, perhaps one of the things you'd point out is that people seem terribly surprised from this mini statement, this spring statement mini budget, that the Chancellor hasn't gone all out like a furlough scheme and supported everybody through every economic pain that's about to come. And perhaps the Prime Minister in particular should have been more honest with the public several months ago that times were going to get tough. I think people are really quite surprised by this, but it was inevitably going to happen to some extent.
And Katy, in tough economic times, it does tend to be the opposition who benefits. Do you get any sense that Labour are making inroads with the country's economic difficulties at the moment?
I think it's interesting looking at the polling about who voters trust most in the economy. There is one which I think puts Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer 1% now ahead of Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. Now, I think that is too small a lead to take, Labour out in front by any means. But I think it does just show you in the sense that one of the things that really hurts Labour in elections is the fact they're not trusted on the economy. So you can see how the cost of living crisis, the fact that Snap polls yesterday, I think it was a YouGov Snap poll, and by some margin people thought that Rishi Sunak needed to do more. You can see how Labour can get something from this crisis and can perhaps use it, whether or not it's enhancing their economic reputation on their own merit or more just watching the Tories take a dent and trying to move it in that sense. You can see how they could potentially work around that. I think that also, though, if you look at the conversations, at the moment, Labour are not coming up with a full plan for funding and how they're going to, how they would ultimately deal with the cost of living. They talk a lot about a windfall tax, the idea that would cover, the various things we're talking about, that would only be one part of it. So I think as we get closer to the next election and Labour have to explain what their spending plan is, they'll come under scrutiny too, because as for the many reasons that we've just had outlined from both James and Kate, the answer of more borrowing and more taxes, there are very few appetising options right now when it comes to the fiscal plan.
Mm. And James, it's perhaps notable that one of the rabbits that Rishi Sunak pulled out of his hat was an income tax cut that's scheduled for 2024. Do you think that's quite politically astute ahead of any general election?
Yeah, and I think it is also designed to send a message saying, look, you can have a cut, there can be a cut in income tax if there is a lid is kept on extra spending. It is essentially saying, that there is a purpose to this fiscal discipline, which is an attempt to cut the basic rate of income tax by April 2024, which is, and I don't think it's entirely a coincidence, but two of the most likely dates for the next election are May 2024 and September 2024. I think one other thing I would say is that, lots of speculation about when the next election is going to be. When you look at these inflation forecasts, I think they definitely suggest that an election in 2024 is more likely than 2023, in that it is going to take about 12 to 18 months for this inflation to pass through the system. And if you were the governing party, you would want to give that inflation as much time as possible to pass through the system before you went to the country.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Kate and Katy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, with Putin's forces bombarding the city of Mariupol as Russia look to take their first major Ukrainian city. Will it fall? And with the invasion flagging, what's the Russian leader's plan? I'm joined now by Dmitri Alperovitch, a security expert and co-founder of the Silverado Policy Accelerator think tank in Washington, and Mark Galeotti, a Spectator contributor and director of Mayak Intelligence. Dmitri, Mark, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV today. Dmitri, could you start us off first of all by giving us a bit of an update on the state of play when it comes to the war and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and sort of the state of play for both sides, I guess?
Well, by and large, the campaign on the Russian side is quite stalled. So many of their axes of advance, their attempts to surround Kiev have stalled. And in fact, due to Ukrainian counteroffensive, they've actually been pushed back out of some of the suburbs. Their attempts to move on Odessa through Mykolaiv or get around Mykolaiv have also been pushed back by Ukrainian resistance. The one area where they're making progress is Mariupol. They've been able to surround the city. They've been able to bomb it into oblivion, of course, and increasingly taking territory there. If there's one city that is in danger of falling in the coming days, it is Mariupol. And once it falls, if it falls, they'll be able to take some of those forces and potentially move them further north and surround the Ukrainian troops that are in the Donbass region. So things aren't necessarily great for the Ukrainians, but the Russians are running into a lot of problems. I'll tell you, there was an alleged intercept released by Ukrainian forces this week, which is a call between a commander on the ground near Mykolaiv area in the south, talking to their superiors in Russia and complaining that 50% of the troops have frostbite on their feet. There have been friendly fire incidents where their own troops have been bombed through airstrikes by Russian planes and potentially artillery as well, that they don't have body armor, they don't have hot food because they don't have a hot stove. So morale is just a complete disaster. And they're saying that the TV is reporting, Russian TV, that they're making a lot of progress and taking a lot of territory. But he says, we're just driving through, not clearing villages, and then we end up fighting essentially a 360-degree battle because they're attacking us from everywhere, they being the Ukrainians, of course.
And Mark, it was interesting, the US Secretary of Defense sort of gave a similar assessment this week. He also said that the Russian advance has stalled. Do you agree with that assessment as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's clear that for a variety of reasons, much to do with the traditional Russian problem of being more teeth than tail. In other words, not really addressing the logistical backup. The Russians are in a position where they can launch local offensives and counteroffensives on a relatively small scale, but as Dmitri said, except around Mariupol, they're not really in a position to actually mount any major offensives. Now, obviously, they are doing what they can to try and untangle their supply issues, and we shouldn't get complacent. But for the moment, this kind of grand notion of a sweep across Ukraine, or at least up to the Dnieper River, that's clearly not happening.
And going further than that, Mark, do you think there's any chance that there have been some assessments this week that Ukraine might actually win the war? Do you think that goes too far, or is that credible?
I'm going to be incredibly irritatingly academic here and say, depends what you mean by win. If you mean, are the Ukrainians going to chase every Russian out of their country, tail between their legs, roll back into Crimea and the Donbass regions? No, I don't think that's likely to happen at all. If nothing else, the point is at the moment the Ukrainians have all the advantage of being on the defence. As soon as they actually started to move offensively, they would actually basically lay themselves open to some of the areas in which the Russians actually have particular capabilities. But more to the point, there is an element of exhaustion that will inevitably creep in. I mean, and this is not exhaustion in the sense of people being tired, though clearly people are tired, because we've seen the Ukrainians being willing to push themselves to extreme limits. It's just a point about, at a certain point, you need to have, a thorough replenishment of units. You need to actually have more material. And it's not just simply a question of another bunch of rockets being sort of passed across the border and such like. So I think what we are seeing is, in many ways, the Ukrainians are winning by denying the Russians any kind of victory. The prospect for actually the Ukrainians being able to push the Russians back locally is absolutely the case. But this is a war that is going to end because of some kind of peace deal or some kind of stalemate. It's not going to see a knockout blow by either side.
And if I can add, the one place I'm watching very closely is the city of Kherson, the one major Ukrainian city that the Russians have been able to take over in the early stages of the campaign. And we're seeing a lot of civil disobedience among the population there. They're coming out in protest. There was a big protest this past weekend. They're blocking traffic for Russian military and Rosguardia, National Guard units. So they're encountering a lot of local resistance, not yet violent, even in the one place that they've been able to take over, which doesn't bode well for them being able to control this country, even if they somehow manage to take it over.
Dmitri, I know you mentioned there pressure on the Ukrainian side. Are we also going to see pressure on the Russian side? I know we've seen unconfirmed reports of around 10,000 deaths in the Russian army. Is this going to place significant pressure on Putin, essentially when the bodies start coming home?
I don't think so, and I would be very careful about those estimates. I think they're probably a little bit too high in terms of casualties on the Russian side. But you also have to remember that the propaganda machine is operating in full force in Russia. Much of that information is not filtering down to the people. A lot of the people that are fighting this war are actually ethnic minorities. There's a lot of Chechens from Kadyrov's units that are fighting the tough fight in Mariupol right now. There's a lot of people from Central Asia that are contractors in the military. So it's unfortunate to say this, but the majority of the Russian public won't care a whole lot about those casualties because just inherent racism in the society. So I don't think that we're anywhere close to the point where the casualties will have an impact on their the war's popularity back home.
And Mark, we mentioned Mariupol back there. The city has been facing a huge bombardment in recent days and weeks. Do you think this is a sign of a sort of changing Russian strategy, which is just going to be focused on humanitarian bombings, essentially targeting cities, and we're going to see that more widely now across Ukraine, do you think?
Yes, I mean, it's an inevitable and depressing side effect of the fact that their initial fantastic notions of a rapid blitzkrieg that'll have the whole country falling into their lap has failed. Now they're having to do it by a sort of thuggish but methodical way, which is, after all, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised because this is what they did in Chechnya, this is what they've been doing in Syria, that actually urban combat is very difficult. It requires high levels of skills and coordination amongst your forces if you're going to go in to places where every basement, every rooftop could be housing a sniper or someone who's going to drop a Molotov cocktail on you. It is, I'm sad to say, a lot easier to bomb the place into rubble and then to plant your flag on top. And that is essentially the approach we're taking. I mean, from the Russians' point of view, after all, to put it very bluntly, they're looking to conquer parts of Ukraine. They don't need the Ukrainians. And therefore, I think the same way as we may well see actually increased use of pressure and humanitarian corridors being used precisely for cleansing the area of, as they would say it, the population. I hesitate to use the word ethnic cleansing because that has some very particular implications, but certainly depopulating sort of areas which will allow the Russians greater opportunities to control them. So unfortunately, Mariupol is probably a harbinger of the future if the Russians are to move on to other cities.
And Dmitri,
I have to say, we're starting to see that, particularly in that allegedly intercepted call. The officer is saying that their initial orders were not to destroy the infrastructure, and he's saying, we can't win here without pummeling everything into the dirt, including the civilians. That was literally the quote from this officer in this alleged intercepted call. So I think the tougher the problem becomes for them, the more brutal they will become in response.
And Dmitri, are you seeing any signs that we're getting closer to a negotiated end to the war, or do you think that's still far too far off to sort of contemplate?
You know, I'm actually getting very pessimistic on a negotiated outcome here. We could potentially have a limited ceasefire because both sides are quite exhausted and they need to resupply. and take a break. But I don't see a lasting negotiated settlement, in part because the more territory that the Russians are taking, like Kherson, if they take Mariupol, and being able to connect Donbass to Crimea via this land bridge and so forth, the less likely I think it becomes that Putin will actually relinquish that territory, and he will demand, of course, that territory to be joined to the LNR and DNR statelets that he's recognized now in the Donbass region. And that's just not going to be palatable to Zelensky. Even if he somehow wanted to make a deal, he just could not sign anything like that without being run out of town by his own people. So I actually think that the likelihood of a peaceful settlement here is very unlikely and becoming less so by each day.
I think I just add in there, in some ways, I'm a little bit more incautiously and unexpectedly optimistic, only very, very slightly. Because I think, although I agree absolutely with this notion that the Russian territorial gains they'll want to hold on to and Zelensky absolutely would not. But on the other hand, what I think is interesting is we must remember these are two wars being fought. There is a war being fought on the battlefield in Ukraine, and then there is a wider economic war being waged against Russia. And I mean, we're already beginning to see the damage being done, the empty shelves, the people unable to get medicines, and the real concern amongst the technocrats. Now, the trouble is, obviously, the technocrats who kind of run the economy and such like, they're not Putin's inner circle. I mean, his basic interest in them is just simply their job is to make sure everything runs and there is the money for the things that Putin wants to happen. But they're clearly trying to indicate to the boss that, in fact, this is not just simply a situation in which diktat will be able to get anywhere. So, I mean, there is a chance that precisely the scarring that is being done to the Russian economy and the potential political implications of that will actually induce Putin to be a little bit more flexible in terms of actually a resolution on the battlefield. I only throw that out as a possibility. Well, I think we're a long way away from being able to say that we see a deal in sight. But that is where, you know, if there is going to be a peace deal, it is going to be because of the intersection of these two wars.
And Dmitri,
I think the problem, though, Mark, is that, and I completely agree with you, the economic damage that's been done to Russia is just absolutely massive. But I bet you that Putin, probably with some reason, thinks that those sanctions, and not even the sanctions, but the companies that have pulled out, they're not coming back. And the sanctions are not going away. In fact, the history shows that sanctions are rarely being dropped on countries once we place them upon them, and certainly that's been the case in Russia. So I have a feeling that he's thinking he's all in, he's already paid the price, and now he has to get something for it.
That's true, and I think therefore, in a way, the Russians would expect some kind of indications on sanctions to be part of any peace deal, which again makes it a lot more complex, because the Ukrainians can agree what the Ukrainians can agree, but they can't speak for the Western sanctions. So many moving parts.
I mean, Dmitri, you mentioned when you were last on the show that you thought the chance of a palace coup against Putin was, I think, close to zero, you said. Do you still stand by that, or do you think the dial has shifted at all there?
I do. I mean, of course, coups happen in a way that's very unpredictable, and we wake up and find out that a coup has occurred without much warning in many countries. In Russia, I think if there's going to be a coup, it would have to come from the intelligence services, and they're still quite loyal to him. Many of the sort of middle layer management may think the boss has gone mad. But the top level guys are all loyal to Putin. Guys like Bortnikov and Narishkin have, of course, been with him for many years, going back to the KGB days. And I don't see them moving on him anytime soon. I just think it's very, very unlikely. Non-zero, but close to zero.
And Mark, can we just touch on, before we finish up, how bad do you think the crackdown is going on in Russia? I know this week that certain social media sites have been banned in the country. Are you getting signs of sort of increasing authoritarianism that's building up, or do you think we've sort of reached a plateau with that?
Oh no, the depressing truth of the matter is, again, I think, to use Dmitri's earlier phrase about going all in, I think a decision has been made that if you're going to go a certain way towards authoritarianism, then you basically will go the rest of the way. I think we are seeing what, for a long time, was an interesting kind of hybrid regime, which was authoritarianism with certain aspects of constitutionalism and certain aspects in which they did sort of try and address certain concerns of the public. and elections were in some ways almost like national focus groups in that respect. Well, I think that's all to the gone. We are, in this respect, in some ways almost heading back to the 1970s, frankly, all the progress that has been lost. And that means that not only will we see increased attempts to try and insulate Russia from the outside world in terms of news and information, but at the same time, we will see a growing willingness to use violent methods, imprisonment and such like, against people who even make the mildest of criticisms against the regime. And we saw this when Putin's most recent utterances, which were quite extraordinary. I mean, his tone was almost Stalinist in what he was saying about the need for a self-cleansing of society against the traitors and parasites and so forth. We're not heading to an age of gulags, but we are definitely heading to authoritarianism. But of course, the only point I would make is that he might want to bring the regime back to the 1970s, but Russians are not the Russians of the 1970s. They will have some sense of what they are losing. And again, whether that'll bring them out on the streets or whatever, I very much doubt, so long as the security forces seem loyal and disciplined and willing to go and crack skulls when need be. But the point is, there will still be a strong anger and depression, I think, within society.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Dmitri. Thank you very much. In this week's cover story, Spectator contributor Owen Matthews writes about Recep Erdogan. The Turkish president, Owen says, has found himself as the middleman between Russia and the West. But whose side is he really on? Owen joins me now, along with Hannah Lucinda Smith, a journalist in Istanbul and the author of Erdogan Rising, The Battle for the Soul of Turkey. Owen and Hannah, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, Owen, you write in the magazine this week about how Erdogan has sort of found himself as a peace broker almost, or deal maker when it comes to Putin and the West over the war in Ukraine. To start us off, can you tell us a bit about how Erdogan sort of ended up in this position?
Well, Erdogan's been in this position for pretty much his whole career, actually. I mean, he's one of the very few world leaders that actually has been described himself as a friend of Vladimir Putin's. I mean, he's more or less since the early 2000s, he has sort of cozied up to Russia and to Putin. They've both been in power for 20 years, so they know each other very well. And there are very strong economic links. There's a strong bottom line to Erdogan's relationship with Putin, and that is that Turkish companies have done tremendously well out of a construction boom in Russia. They've constructed enormously expensive pipelines under the Black Sea, and Russia now provides up to 30% of Turkey's gas, and it's Russia's building him a set of nuclear power stations. So, and most crucially, because Turkey is of course a member of NATO, in 2017 he took an even more dramatic step, and that was that he bought a very sophisticated Russian air defense system called the S-400 from Putin instead of buying within NATO, and that really annoyed the Americans. So for a long time, despite Erdogan's actually been sort of playing both sides against the middle, but in fact not just both sides but all sides. I mean, because he's also has close economic ties with Ukraine, most notably between the company owned by his son-in-law, Seljuk Bayraktar, who's actually been supplying Ukrainians with the very deadly and very effective drones that have been the surprise sort of super weapon of the war.
Mm. And Hannah, when it comes to the peace process, do you think Erdogan's sort of overstating his diplomatic credentials to this, or do you agree that he's sort of managed to become incredibly important to the process now?
Well, I mean, I think, in Erdogan's ideal world, he would be this kind of mediating figure between, warring camps. That's what he, says that Turkey is or should be. But, in reality, he is kind of stuck between these two sides. And although, that has come in useful to NATO over the past few weeks, both sides now see him as more useful than he was a month ago. I think, from Turkey's perspective, it just can't afford to completely alienate Russia. We had a bit of a taste in 2016 of what Russia can do to Turkey with really not much effort at all. So in late 2015, Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet close to the Syrian border, and diplomacy completely broke down. Putin slapped on some embargoes, which included blocks on Turkish agricultural exports, also stopped most Russian tourists coming to Turkey for holidays in the summer of 2016, and it had a really massive
impact. And I think, that's going to be playing in the back of Erdogan's mind.
I mean, in your piece, Owen, you call Putin and Erdogan a bit of frenemies almost. What's their relationship like?
Well, it's been incredibly stormy. I mean, as Hannah says, I mean, it's Syria that really. I mean, it started breaking down really in 2014 because the annexation of Crimea actually impacted Crimean Tatars, with whom Turkey has a sort of an Erdogan in particular, because he has a slightly Putin-like actually sort of nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman diaspora and the Turkish diaspora. He had a sort of kind of proprietorial interest in the fate of the Crimean Tatars, so that kind of brought them into conflict. And Erdogan was actually roundly condemned Putin for that. But then things really hit the fan with Syria, because in fact, as it turned out, the Assad's forces, backed by Russian air power, actually started hitting many groups that were actually affiliated with the Turkish army, both actual Turkish army soldiers that were based around inside Syria and Iraq, and also Syrian rebel groups affiliated to Turkmens, again like sort of ethno-nationalists, sort of interest from Erdogan. So Syria actually brought them very close to the brink, and Hannah's already talked about their actual breakdown in relations, which they sort of patched up. But they're kind of on again, off again friends. There's a lot that connects them, but actually Erdogan, as Hannah said, actually doesn't have a huge amount of room to maneuver, because actually, much as the Americans will want him to pick a side at this week's NATO summit, actually he doesn't really have the option of breaking off ties with Putin or of the West. He's stuck in the middle. So in that sense, actually, that suits Russia, because they see Erdogan as an interlocutor. But it's also a little bit problematic, and I think there's going to be some problems coming down the pike, because the shape of the ultimate peace negotiations is essentially going to be Putin's face. Putin can't withdraw without actually a solution that allows him to claim victory. NATO cannot allow him to claim victory. That's the catch-22 that we're going to be dealing with in a few weeks' time. And Erdogan is in a hurry, for strong economic reasons, to actually fix it. And so I think that's really going to be the debate. Like, is Erdogan actually going to back a face-saving solution that actually allows Putin to withdraw and claim victory, but which NATO is not happy with?
And to turn a bit more to the domestic then, Hannah, Erdogan's got elections coming up next year. How much are they going to impact, well, how much could the war potentially impact those elections and his own position in power?
Sure. Well, I mean, the number one issue for people in Turkey in the lead up to the elections is the economy. Poll after poll shows it just way out ahead of anything else. Inflation is towards 50%. You can feel it every time you go into the supermarket here. Prices rise almost every day, and wages just aren't keeping up with it. People are really, really, really struggling. And clearly, the fact that a lot of Turkey's grain comes from Ukraine, the fact that there's probably not going to be many Russian tourists in Turkey this year. The tourism sector is a huge part of the Turkish economy. It's about 10-13%. And also the threat of further sanctions, which, of course, Putin could slap on Turkey again. I think that's really, really going to, influence Erdogan's thinking. But, here's the thing about Erdogan. He's not a sophisticated leader when it comes to international relations. He's proved himself really, really good at reading the mood of his people. And what he's done over the past 5 years particularly is he's often used foreign relations for domestic ends. So he's stoked rows with various people, he's stirred anti-Americanism, he's stirred sentiment against the EU, and cozying up to Putin has been part of that. Now, the problem now is, when you speak to the kind of older generation of Turkish diplomats or anybody who knows the history of the region, Turkey and Russia are not natural allies. They're natural, if not enemies, and adversaries. They're competing powers in the same neighbourhood. And, when you talk to kind of older diplomats and analysts and people like that, they'll say, well, this is what Erdogan has forgotten. And, with all his kind of playing foreign affairs off against domestic politics, he's now backed into a corner. So, I think it's really going to be a problem for him. But, domestically, the number one thing is going to be the economy. You know, people do have sympathy for the Crimean Tatars. There's a huge amount of sympathy here for, the people in Ukraine. I think, on the streets, most people are overwhelmingly kind of horrified at what Russia's doing there. But, these things are secondary. If the economy goes even worse, it's going to be really, really disastrous for Erdogan.
And Owen, going back slightly, you mentioned earlier the Bayraktar TB2 drones and the sort of the impact they're having on the war in Ukraine at the moment. I'd be very interested to know what you think, and if you thought that Turkey's sort of links with Ukraine and supply of the drones was an intentional snub to Russia, or do you think they've just ended up sort of inadvertently having a semi-influential position in the war because of this?
They were not supplied by the Turkish government. It's a private company. Obviously that's it's a political decision, who you allow your private companies to sell arms to. But I think nobody expected, not the Turks, not anyone, not even actually the majority of Putin's cabinet, as we now know. I have it on very good authority from someone very close to Dmitri Peskov that during that very fateful, sort of crazy Security Council meeting on February 21st, in which Putin sort of dressed down his chief of foreign intelligence and so on, only 3 people in the room were aware of the full plan to actually launch a full-scale invasion. So, which is pretty extraordinary. It was Putin himself, Sergei Shoigu, his defense minister, and Alexander Botnikov, the head of the FSB. Everyone else was in the dark. So, Putin's cabinet was in the dark. Zelensky was saying it wasn't going to happen. The Turks also presumed it wasn't going to happen. So no, it was not a snub to Putin. It was just business. No one expected that the war to break out on that scale. And already, it was talked about because they had been used to devastating effect by the Azeris in Nagorno-Karabakh in the last year. So everyone knew that the Bayraktars. It's sort of strange sort of twist. I'm not an expert in military hardware, but my sources tell me it's a sort of interesting, it's a sort of advantage through sort of slowness and relative simplicity, strangely enough. The Bayraktars are effective not because they're super fast or because they have a super sophisticated communication system. They're actually slow, they're propeller driven, and they have actually sort of variable radio communications that have managed to sort of brilliantly outfox the Russian radio defense systems and have destroyed a lot of Russian armor. But they have themselves, of course, been destroyed in large numbers. The Bayraktars have been shot down. And Erdogan is currently refusing to resupply them or blocking more supplies. So in that sense, he's that's another example of his fence sitting. Like the Bayraktars have been an ace in Zelensky's arsenal, but so far he's not getting any more.
And there is a family connection, isn't there, between the Bayraktar and Erdogan? How there's quite a close one, if that's right.
Yeah, well, the Bayraktar is married to Erdogan's younger daughter.
It's about as close as you can get. It might make awkward family dinners. Hannah, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on how Turkey's sort of relationship with the West is going, and how long it can last with them sort of having a semi-open relationship with Russia.
Sure. Well, honestly, this conflict has just come at a really, really useful time for Erdogan. Ever since Joe Biden took office, Erdogan's been trying to kind of work his way back in there with the West, mostly for economic reasons. He's talked at home about how he's going to turn over a new page in relations with the EU and with the US. And the US in particular just hasn't been that interested. But now, clearly, he is useful to the West, and particularly not just useful, actually, imperative for NATO. So I think, he's trying to take full advantage of that. One of the things that has been reported that the US is going to ask Turkey to do at the NATO conference is to transfer that Russian S-400 missile defense system that Owen mentioned to Ukraine to be used against Russian forces. Now, I don't think that Erdogan's going to go that far. I think that's really going to show the limits of any kind of renewed friendship or renewed loyalty to the West and to the NATO alliance. But yeah, certainly, in the space of a month, this is probably the best that relations have been between Turkey and particularly America, probably for 5 years.
I know, and do you think that balancing act that Turkey is doing at the moment can last as well?
Yes, it has to, because just as Erdogan can't afford, for the reasons we Hannah mentioned, to lose the Russian connection, neither can Putin lose his interlocutor. I mean, even though Erdogan is not really his friend, and he's closed the straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, to Russian naval traffic and so on, and he's not really a friend, but he's the closest thing to a friend that Erdogan that Putin has inside NATO. So Putin needs him, and also as Hannah said, like Biden is suddenly, and Europe are suddenly interested in that part of the world once more. So Erdogan finds himself in actually sort of an unexpectedly strong position. He needs to keep both sides sweet, and both sides need to keep him sweet.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Hannah. And finally, Spectator contributor Matt Ridley writes in this week's magazine about China's zero COVID strategy. The country is still using draconian localised lockdowns to keep the virus at bay. Will this work? Matt joins me now alongside Cindy Yu, who hosts the Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcast. Cindy and Matt, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, Matt, to start us off, you write in the magazine this week about China's zero COVID strategy and how things are going in the country there at the moment. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about the situation there?
Yes, well, it appears that the Omicron variant, particularly this new BA.2 variant of Omicron, which is more infectious, is spreading very rapidly in Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and probably now in the rest of China too. It looks unlikely that China will be able to maintain its policy of preventing the spread of COVID simply by public health measures, and that it'll have to go to another strategy. This is very worrying for China because there's a huge population there. It's not fully vaccinated, including the elderly. In Hong Kong in particular, there's been quite a lot of elderly people who've not been vaccinated and who have been quite badly affected by this virus. So I think China is facing a serious COVID waves 2 years after sort of telling us rather triumphantly and opening a museum in Wuhan to the effect that it had conquered COVID and taught the rest of the world how to do so.
And just to be clear, Matt, are you saying that the zero COVID strategy is no longer viable?
I think the zero COVID strategy is not viable in any country. I mean, New Zealand and Australia and other countries kept up a zero COVID policy at some huge cost for a long time, but they did at least use that time to develop vaccines, or rather to inoculate people with vaccines. And that meant that once they effectively abandoned their zero COVID strategy, which countries like Australia are now effectively doing, it wasn't going to be too bad. But I think it's unlikely any country will be able to pursue a zero COVID strategy from now on because of the highly infectious nature of the BA.2 variant of the Omicron variant of the virus, which spreads pretty stealthily. You know, you're infectious before you know it, etc.
And Cindy, do you agree that the virus is impossible to control at this stage in China?
Well, I think where I differ with Matt is that I think the zero COVID policy has many problems, but ineffective it is not, by which I mean the Chinese call it dynamic zero COVID. So the problem is not having cases per se, but the dynamic nature of it. So they say what it means is that any COVID cases are clamped down very, very quickly. Now, Omicron obviously presents a very unique and unprecedented challenge in that because it is just so infectious. But at the same time, the Chinese lockdown, the zero COVID policy is nothing like we can imagine here in the West in how strict it is. And that is why I think it will still work. So just taking a look at what it means on the ground. If you have COVID in China right now, you'll be taken off to a centralized quarantine center. And if you have severe illness, you'll be taken to hospital. But no one is allowed to have COVID at home. And certainly you're not allowed to have COVID with anyone else. Any of your contacts and even contacts of positive cases are being taken to these centralized quarantine areas as well, tested regularly, and if any of them develop COVID, they are then taken to a separate place. My mother, she's just gone to China last week. For foreigners going into China, you now have to take 3 PCR tests before going into the country, and then you're put through weeks of hotel quarantine. For her, it's 2 weeks depending on where you're landing, and then 1 week of home quarantine. So So that's the kind of hermetic seal that the Chinese have put on this. And by the way, any city that's found with COVID cases, everyone has gone through mass testing. So it's not a symptomatic, you can get a test or anything like that. Every single person is instructed to get 3 tests a week. So that's the kind of massive state infrastructure that is being put into place. And I think the problems with the zero COVID policy are manifold. For example, as Matt mentioned, how do you get out of it? Without vaccination, what is the future for that? And I think that's the biggest problem. And then the other problem is the massive state funding that's going into all of this. I think it's estimated that last summer in one of the Guangzhou flares, it was $1 billion spent just on testing alone. So those are the kind of numbers that we don't normally get to see on the outside, but will be costing Chinese coffers. So I think those are the problems, but I don't think that zero COVID policy is failing insofar as it looks unsuited to be treating Omicron, but it is still going to be saving lives at the end of the day just because the Chinese state is just putting so much money into the system.
And Matt, how much do you think China's problems are down to the vaccine rollout there? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, China did develop a vaccine very early on. It is widely regarded in most of the world as being not as effective as the Western vaccines, and they haven't allowed the Western vaccines in. So I think there is a real problem in that, the vaccines aren't all that brilliant even in the West because they don't prevent transmission now. They do prevent serious disease. So if you have an even less effective vaccine, the reason for not letting Pfizer and other firms sell their vaccines into China seems to be a degree of sort of pride and protectionism, which I think is a mistake. So I do think that that's an issue. But just to pick up on what Cindy said, which is very, very interesting, one of the things that I'm concerned about is the degree to which we in the West were told that we should model our public health measures against COVID on the Chinese model. There was a lot of praise of China early on, having got it right, etc. And I don't think that should be allowed to pass, at this moment when we now know that, we couldn't have had as draconian a lockdown as Cindy describes in the West. And that's what would be necessary to have a zero COVID policy in the West. Elimination, I think, was impossible once it had got out of Wuhan and into the rest of the world. We now know.
Yes, I absolutely agree, Matt. I mean, lockdown, we use the same word to describe what we went through here in the UK and what China is going through now, but it is really not the same thing at all. People in China have very little recourse to change policy. There are no lockdown skeptics in the public sphere for obvious reasons. We've had situations where if you're in Disneyland, a place that holds tens of thousands of visitors, someone else tests positive on the day that you go, you're locked down in Disneyland for hours until you can get tested and released. That's the kind of civil liberties erosion that is not at all possible here, as much as we rail against lockdown in a Western format already.
And Matt, do you think China's troubles now have made lockdowns less likely in the West? I mean, you mentioned in your piece the fact that Neil Ferguson said he got sort of the inspiration for lockdown from China. Do you think that's sort of undermined the case for lockdowns more broadly?
I think that, a lot of us thought lockdowns probably were necessary right at the start. I certainly took that view. But I quite quickly began to realise, as Professor Mark Woolhouse of Edinburgh University has spelled out in his book, The Year the World Went Mad, that lockdowns are designed to eliminate the virus. They don't work for simply controlling the spread of the virus. They either, they can buy you a bit of time, that's for sure. But once you realise that you can't eliminate the virus in 3 weeks or 3 months or something, then you've got to find a policy that enables you to live with the virus for 2 or 3 years. And 2 or 3 years of lockdowns are not acceptable. The mental cost, the physical cost, the health cost, the economic cost on the population is simply too high. I think we've learnt that lesson. I think we were right to open up in July in 2021 and again not to lock down in December 2021 when most of the public health experts were urging the government to do so. Yes, we had an Omicron wave in January. but it did not result in a significant increase in deaths and hospitalizations, at least nothing like what was predicted by some. And so we are now in a position where in the UK and much of the rest of the West, we can get back to living normally while having the occasional very bad cold called COVID. I just had that myself 2 weeks ago. It's no fun, but it's not life-threatening, and we have to be able to live like that, while of course, making special efforts to protect the most vulnerable people.
Well, I'm glad you're feeling better, Matt. Cindy, Matt touched on there the economic cost of this for China. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how big do you think that will be? I mean, we've seen some big cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen go into lockdown recently. Do you think China's going to have a big economic hit this year from the zero COVID fallout?
So earlier this month, China had another one of these Chinese Communist Party meetings called the Two Sessions. And there, the Premier Li Keqiang announced China's GDP figure for this year, or target for this year, 5.5%, which sounds like a lot to us, but for China, that's the lowest in 3 decades. So the Chinese authorities, even, on the outset, are making clear that they're not expecting the economy to not take a hit this year. And we also saw last week President Xi make this commitment to more transparency in regulation in the stock market, which made the stocks go up again because they recognise that the economy needs a bit of a boost. But a lot of the costs we just don't simply see. We don't see the aviation damage. If you think back to pre-COVID times, the Chinese were super cosmopolitan. Because of globalization, they were traveling everywhere. There was trade going everywhere. A lot of that is gone now. Someone like my mother going home has to do 3 PCR tests to get there, and the tickets are not easy to come by either. So all of that will have an economic cost. And in China as well, there are 300 million informal workers, people without contracts, who overnight can see their jobs get lost if they're unlucky enough to be in a city that was locked down overnight. So all of these things will have costs, but I think China thinks that with its zero COVID policy, if it's one city at a time that goes down, and then they normally expect that within a month, at least with Delta, you could get rid of those local infections. Omicron, it might take longer. At least that means other cities can still thrive in the meantime. This kind of community infection would, they believe, have more disruption. And I guess, zero COVID you can criticize it for many reasons, but on saving lives, if that is your only narrow metric, it is doing quite well.
Do you agree with that, Matt? Has it been a success in that sense?
Yes, I think you can't deny that draconian lockdowns have saved lives. I think there's only really 2 policies that have saved lives during this pandemic. One is lockdowns and the other is vaccines. I don't myself believe that masks and school closures and many of the other things have worked well, or indeed, disinfecting our hands, etc. We now know that wasn't necessarily good advice. I think it's worth just being a bit humble here. This virus has been humiliating for a lot of people. It's been humiliating for public health advice, often not necessarily getting it right early on or even later on during the pandemic. It's been humiliating for politicians in terms of what measures they can take, etc. And as Cindy says, it's been humiliating for a huge nation that was opening up to the world and has now had to turn itself back into a bit of a hermit kingdom, which cannot be good for the world. It is cutting Chinese people off from the rest of the world. That's bad for them and bad for us, much as the war is doing for Russia. So it does feel like a very different world from 5 years ago that we're now living in, with these rather dramatic balkanizations of the global body politic.
That's a really interesting point. And Cindy, I know Xi Jinping stakes a lot of his international reputation on how well China handled the virus at the beginning of the pandemic. Is that starting to sort of crumble away a bit now and affect his own leadership, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there are people within China who are ever so slightly starting to crack through, this veneer of zero COVID zeitgeist. People are able to now come out and say, well, maybe we should think about the next steps. And the reason China has been so slow on doing that is exactly as you say, John, that Xi Jinping has made this part of his political legacy. After the initial humiliation of the Wuhan outbreak, Xi was saying, you know, we've got the PPE, we've got the lockdowns, and we've got the vaccine diplomacy. Well, on all three of those things, there are things that criticisms one can make of it. And especially on the zero COVID policy, it's become such a political point that you can't help but realise that the politicians in China are not following the science and are really just, you know, embarrassed to turn around, and they're realising that they're too slow. Intriguingly, we are seeing signs that there is more allowance of discussion of the next steps. So, for example, one Shanghai epidemiologist, Zhang Wenhong, this time last year said that we might want to live with COVID. He got absolutely pilloried online. These days, when he says something similar, you know, people online are allowed to say that, you know, have more diverse views. So you do wonder the changing position of censors in that respect. And I think China hopes that lockdowns for it has been a time-buying mechanism, as Matt was saying. And it hopes that by the end of this year, it can develop its own mRNA vaccines and that it can have very good antivirals, which it has already approved a few of, including from Pfizer, actually, under emergency approvals. So it's hoping that it can medicate its way out of the situation with better medication than just its vaccines at the moment. And until then, it just has to basically buy time. And the question is, does that still work with Omicron, and at what cost? Because the cost is getting ever higher the more contagious the variants become.
I mean, Matt, as a final point, you mentioned in your piece that the West should perhaps be doing more and sending millions of doses of our vaccines to China. I guess it comes down to a question of pride. Do you think China will accept that gift?
I think it's unlikely. I think the Chinese pride is very involved here. And it would have to be a perfectly commercial arrangement. Look, we've got vaccines now. We probably don't need to put fourth boosters into most people's arms in the West. Why won't you take these? There has been such a strong tendency in Chinese biotech in particular to see Western technology as something you want to learn from, you want to emulate, and you then want to replace with your own technology, that I think it isn't an easy moment for the Chinese government to say, actually, please, could you help us? But it would be sensible, I think, if they did that. And just another point, if I may, if we cannot open up again to travel from China for a long time, that will prevent Chinese scientists, particularly from Wuhan, coming to the West and giving us useful bits of information that might enable us to solve the enduring puzzle of where this virus came from and how it jumped into human beings in the first place. Something we still haven't solved, and we're getting very, very little cooperation from the Chinese government in tackling.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Cindy. And if you want to listen to Cindy's podcast, you can find Chinese Whispers on all the usual podcast platforms or at spectator.co.uk/whispers. That's it for this week. Once again, we're delighted that Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management is sponsoring the week in 60 minutes. Canaccord will provide the expertise you need to build your wealth with confidence. You can visit candowealth.com to find out more. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.